This take might get me in trouble with the Charlie Kirk crowd, and that's okay, but it needs to be said. But before I get into it, my name is Rocky Pedden. I am the host of A Renewed Republic. So back to the content. Yeah, there is something I think I need to get off my chest with respect to Charlie Kirk, and that is what he did on college campuses cannot be considered debate, full stop. If you want to call it open mic, if you want to call it trading barbs, go for it. I think that's appropriate. But when we think about debate, that is something more meaningful and deeper than what Charlie Kirk was doing with those college students. Now, a couple caveats to this. First, that doesn't mean that he shouldn't have been able to do it. He definitely should have. And I think him going to college campuses and, he talked about advancing the dialogue and the discourse and all that good stuff. I agree with all of that. And on top of that, he definitely shouldn't have been killed for having these opinions or doing these things. That's ridiculous. No one in this country should die to gun violence, really for any reason, right? I think we all can agree, right? Okay. So in terms of debate, what should a debate look like then if it's not this open hot mic take? To me, it's two parties, whether that's groups of people or individuals, who agree on talking about specific subject matter that they then can prepare for. Like, that's really the essence of a debate. And what's the benefit to that? Well, it's really substantial when you think about it. Instead of having situations like our presidential debates where you have these two people who come together, they don't supposedly know what the questions are beforehand, and they're asked these questions on the spot. What are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to earn bonus points from people by who can say the wittiest thing or who can make the biggest dig on somebody. They're looking for marketing points. They're not looking for education. They're not looking to showcase their aptitude or their knowledge or any of that. And that's what this country needs. We need to be, as a citizenry, up to date in terms of what our elected officials or the prospects for our elected officials, making sure that we can actually grade them on what their knowledge is. And that's what a debate should provide to us as the citizens of this country. So when we have a debate on education, for example, we could have a conversation between, like President Trump or Vice President Kamala Harris, and they can actually dive deep into their positions. And within the context of education, there can be, a series of questions that the moderator is going to ask, but it needs to stay on point. And when you have these agreed to debates, that allows the moderator to pull those people into the conversation more deeply. And it makes it very obvious to the listeners as to who knows their stuff and who doesn't. Who's coming here to trade barbs and win cheap shots or political points, and who actually understands the problems that average Americans are facing and also has solutions to address those problems. That, to me, is real debate. And I think if we were to look at what Charlie Kirk was doing, that was not it. What he was doing, I think, maybe to some extent is useful in actually having the conversation opened up. But I think as a next step, what we really need to be asking for is more of these structured debates. And I think if Charlie Kirk had done that, if he had gone to the schools and say, I want to do a debate on these topics, get me students or professors, and we're going to have a conversation here. Here's the recommended moderators that we should use to really guide the conversation. Here are the questions that we should be answering and going after. That gives the opportunity for both parties to do their research, and not only their research for what they want to say, but also their opposition research and what other people might say. And then they can have a really productive conversation. Because I think when you look at a lot of that footage from Charlie Kirk, a lot of it is unproductive. That's not to say all of it is unproductive, but a lot of it is. And as an example, I'm going to look at, and I actually already have looked at, the George Floyd incident, right? Obviously, Derek Chauvin, the police officer involved, was found guilty of homicide because he kneeled on George Floyd's neck for 9.5 minutes, and it ultimately led to his death. Now, Charlie Kirk came out and said at a later point that the coroner actually said he died of an overdose. And there's some other context that he provided there. Turns out that wasn't accurate. And the coroner said, no, I'm ruling this a homicide, not an overdose. However, and this is really important, something I applaud Charlie for doing, he actually had Turning Point USA come out and actually issue, and I don't know if it was a formal apology, but they actually addressed the fact that that they had gotten it wrong, more or less. And I think that's really important. It's something I think everybody can learn from. Another person who did this really, really well, if anybody listens to the Sean Ryan podcast, I do occasionally, he had a situation like this not too long ago where someone was saying that, I think it was Kamala Harris had posed in front of some supplies that were being sent out to victims of Hurricane Helene. And that person said like this was just pure fantasy. Those supplies never got delivered. And actually they did get delivered. What happened is they had to, I think it was they had to shift to a different plane. And so like there was some confusion there. But Sean Ryan came out and said, actually, like what was represented on my podcast was factually incorrect. And he addressed it and he apologized for it. And I just think like that's integrity. And that's what we need from people who are putting themselves in a position to be influencers of the common discourse. And, you know, I applaud Charlie Kirk for doing that in this instance. And I also applaud Sean Ryan and everybody else who has ever done that as well. However, going back to Derek Chauvin and George Floyd, later on at some future date, I can't remember what university it was at, but this case came up again and the student was talking about it and talking about how it was a homicide. And Charlie Kirk came back and said, no, it wasn't a homicide. The coroner had ruled it an overdose. And the person didn't have a good response. And I think they didn't have a good response because it's not a debate. They weren't ready for that conversation. They didn't do the appropriate amount of research. Now, you could say that if she's going to talk about that, or he's going to talk about, you know, Derek Chauvin and George Floyd, that they should know all their facts. And maybe you're right, but we're also talking about kids. And I say kids meaningfully. You know, people who are between 17 and maybe 22 years old. Charlie Kirk has, on average, probably a 10, 11, or 12-year advantage on them in terms of their frontal lobe development. And so it's not surprising that they aren't prepared for that. And if they're not schooled in debate, then like maybe they don't know how to prepare for that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's an important distinction to call out what Charlie Kirk was doing and how that compares to debate, because it's not the same thing. And what we do need, what this country needs desperately, in my opinion, is deep debate talking about these issues that are influencing Americans day in and day out. Education is one, sure, but I think even more importantly is healthcare. You know, we have, what is it, like 500,000 people every year go bankrupt because of bills from healthcare. Like, that's absurd. You know, we live in the richest country in the history of the world, and we have people going bankrupt because they had to go to the emergency room for something. That shouldn't happen in this country. Another video on that will come out later. But by and large, what I really wanted to address today is that Charlie Kirk was not debating these kids in most cases. It was an open mic, and they were exchanging barbs. I would say like it wasn't always negative. I think there's a lot of instances of Charlie Kirk being really positive and wholesome in his responses. That does not, however, change the fact that there was also responses in which he used hurtful language and he was really negative to marginalized groups of people, and that shouldn't be overlooked either. So again, to recap, we need more debate in this country. We need to have deep conversations about the problems that we face and the solutions to address them. And we need to have open discourse and dialogue. On that, Charlie Kirk and I agree. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.